There's a lot of stories in the Bible that are just weird. You know, there's times where I'm reading and I read through a story and I just have to sit there for a second and I say, what am I even supposed to do with that? We're going to talk about one today. Let me give you sort of the brief synopsis, right? So these men, they bring a blind man to Jesus, and Jesus heals a lot of blind men. I don't want to for a second pretend like it's a normal or like a routine thing, but it's Jesus. He heals a lot of blind people. You kind of know how it's going to go. But it's different this time. For some reason, Jesus takes this blind man by the hand, and instead of healing him right there, he leads him by the hand all the way outside of the city limits. All the way away from the disciples, away from the crowd. They're outside of the city. And then Jesus spits on him. Now, I'd like to think that maybe Jesus spit on his hands and then touched it, but even that's gross. What are you doing? But whatever that means, he spits on him, and he touches his eyes, and he says, "Hey, are you better now?" And the guy says, "Well, I can kind of see some people, but they look a lot more like trees than they look like people." Actually, one second. Bo, you're an official eye doctor. Opinion here. Is that man healed at that point? Not fully. Okay, so he's not healed yet. I don't really know what's going on. So then Jesus, a second time, puts his hands on his eyes, and then the guy can see. Now, it doesn't take a very close reading of this miracle to realize it doesn't look like anything else in the entire Gospels. For one, and most troubling to me, why does it take Jesus 2 attempts to heal that blind man's eyes? You ever think about that? Jesus does a lot of miracles. Some that I would contend are much more impressive than just healing a blind man. Not that that's not impressive, but he raises people from the dead easily. And so I would read that story, even growing up, and I would say, well, I know Jesus didn't fail the first time, but I don't really know what he did either. Luckily, I think Mark shows us exactly what Jesus did. If you want to turn to Mark 8, that's where we're going to be. Mark is one of those Gospels. All the Gospels kind of have their individual little personalities. And Mark is very much a show, not tell kind of a Gospel. He doesn't give you a lot of extra details. He just gives you the essentials of what you need, and he moves on. And I think this story is one of those things. I think what Jesus knew and what Mark saw is that this miracle here, as weird as it is, offers a very interesting perspective to a spiritual problem. And so, as we read through Mark 8, I want to kind of come to this story in its context, and we're going to look together about viewing Jesus. And I think what Mark is really going to ask us here, as he asks of the disciples in the text, who do you see Jesus as? And is the person that you see Jesus as, does it line up with who Jesus actually is? So if you're in Mark 8 with me, we're going to start in verse 11. We're kind of picking up in the middle of a crazy time here. This comes directly after Jesus just fed a crowd of 4,000 people. Not to be confused with the time that Jesus feeds a crowd of 5,000 people. That's earlier in Mark. So Jesus has done these 2 amazing miracles that show his immense power. And yet, the story opens here, and Jesus has found not praise and glory for what he has just done, but he's found some critics. And so if you're in Mark 8, let's just start in verse 11 together. It says, "The Pharisees came and began to argue with Jesus, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit and said, 'Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation.' And he left them, and he got into a boat again and went to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus cautioned them, saying, 'Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod.' And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, 'Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive or understand yet? Are your hearts still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?' And they said to him, 12. And 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up then? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, 'Do you not yet understand?'" And we'll stop there for now. So the Pharisees, they ambush Jesus and his disciples, and they're demanding a miracle here, which I find fascinating. Because, if you read the book of Mark, especially the first 8 chapters, Jesus is constantly doing signs and miracles. It seems like every other verse is a new sign and a new miracle that Jesus is doing. In fact, again, this comes right off the back of Jesus feeding 4,000 people miraculously, which I would consider quite a sign. And so, let's give these men some credit. Maybe the Pharisees, they weren't there. They didn't see that miracle. Maybe they had just sort of heard that this guy does miracles. I would think maybe you would just want to follow Jesus around for a bit and see what he does. Again, the story before this is a miracle. The story after this is a miracle. Just be a little patient. The Pharisees are not at all patient. They want a sign, and they want it now. They want irrefutable, definite proof that Jesus is from heaven. They had no faith in anything they had heard. So as they question Jesus, I love the way that Mark gives us this little detail that Jesus sighs deeply. I've thought about that a lot over the course of this week. What the feeling behind that would have been. Was it sort of an angry sigh? Was he just disappointed in these Pharisees? I don't know. But either way, Jesus denies them a sign. He wouldn't show them a sign. And to be honest, I think the implication of the text is, even if they would have seen a sign, they wouldn't have believed it. The Pharisees have no faith in Jesus. They don't care who Jesus claims to be. They are completely blind. And then immediately after that, Jesus sets off with the disciples, and he begins to warn them of the yeast and leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. The Pharisees, who we just saw, out of pride, they reject who Jesus really is. And Herod, earlier in Mark, when he heard of Jesus' miracles, he said, "Oh, did John the Baptist come back from the dead?" A man who later in the Gospels excitedly begs Jesus for a sign when he was on trial. The metaphor here is clear that these prideful leaders, both the religious ones in the Pharisees' case and the social and political ones in Herod's case, they don't understand Jesus, and they don't want to understand Jesus. Some of them see him as a problem, a threat. Some of them just see him as a little party trick, an entertainer, a magic man. They're blind. And Jesus tells his disciples, don't be like them. But the disciples, they struggle with this. They're having a hard time with this saying, Jesus is doing all this talking about yeast and leaven, and all they can think is, we don't even have any bread. How are you talking about leaven right now? We don't have any bread. They're struggling with it. And Jesus just looks at them and he says, how can you guys not understand yet? Jesus is very patient with the disciples over the course of the Gospels. But this seems like one of the times where his frustration with them really bleeds through. He says, you guys saw the miracles. You were there when I fed the 5,000. You picked up the leftovers. You ate the bread. You were there when I just a few verses ago fed the 4,000. You picked up the baskets there. You ate of that bread. How do you guys not understand yet? Jesus points out the disciples, they're so concerned about the physical sign. They're so concerned about the physical bread that they have completely missed the spiritual point. They may have seen all the power of Jesus. They may have seen all the miracles, but they failed to understand what these miracles said about the one who did them. They failed to understand that these signs pointed to the fact that He was the bread of life. They had seen the miracles, but they had failed to apply them to their lives. Don't get lost in the details here. Here's what we need to remember, especially for as far as this lesson this morning is concerned. Both passages here with the Pharisees and with the disciples show complete spiritual blindness to who Jesus really is. The Pharisees saw Jesus maybe as a miracle worker, maybe as some sort of magic man performer, but definitely as a problem. But signs or no signs, they didn't understand Jesus' purpose. The disciples had clearly seen the signs. They were there. They had a front row seat to all of the power of Jesus. And yet even they don't really understand Him. They don't get the point. They had a faith in Jesus. We're going to see that very clearly in a second. They believed in Him. But they had no idea what to do with Him. At this point, the crowds, the Pharisees, Herod, and even the disciples themselves show that they are completely blind to Jesus' true character and what He's here on earth to do. So the next story in Mark 8 is that story we opened with, the two-step healing of the blind man. And I want to get back there, but I want to read a different story first. We're going to skip over the two-step miracle for now, and I want to get to verses 27 through 38 first. This is what happens directly after Jesus heals the blind man. Starting in verse 27, it says, "And Jesus went on with the disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way He asked His disciples, 'Who do people say that I am?' And they told Him, 'John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets.' And He asked them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Peter answered Him, 'You are the Christ.' And He strictly charged them to tell no one about Him. And He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and must be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all these things plainly. And Peter took Him aside and began to rebuke Him. But turning and seeing His disciples, He rebuked Peter and said, 'Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.'" So Jesus is walking with His disciples, Do you ever have to do a pop quiz in class? That's like my least favorite thing ever. The teacher says, you come into class and the teacher says, all right, notes away, books in the bag, I've got a few questions for you. Let me tell you, a test I can study for. Even if I know that we're going to have quizzes weekly, that's going to be fine. I was not a good student when it came to pop quizzes. It's not my thing. I never was ready. Jesus pulls a pop quiz on his disciples here. They're walking and he seems to just stop and he turns to them and he said, hey, what's the word around town? Who have you heard people say that I am? And they have lots of answers. They say, well, some people think that you're John the Baptist. You'll remember that's who Herod and his people think that he might be. He said, okay, some people think that you're a prophet. Lots of people think that he's a prophet. We see that all across the Scripture. But then Jesus turns to them and says, okay, who do y'all think that I am? And I don't know, the way I've always kind of envisioned this story, when Jesus asks them, who do the people say I am? They've got all kinds of answers. They're just chatting away about it. And then when Jesus says, okay, what do you guys think? The way I picture it in my head, it goes silent for a second. Their faces get a little pale. They don't know quite what to say. And eventually, Peter, the usual spokesman, he delivers his, and I think the disciples' opinion. He says, you are the Christ, in verse 29, the Messiah, the Son of God. That's the right answer. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. For just a moment, it feels like the disciples finally get it. As blind as they were just a second ago, they understand. They finally see Jesus. But it is just for a moment before the illusion is broken. Because when Jesus tells them plainly that what it means to be the Christ, the Son of God, Mark tells us, he spoke plainly about this, by the way. Jesus does a lot of teaching in parables and kind of hard to understand sayings. Mark makes it clear this is not one of those moments. He told them plainly, I am going to be rejected, and I am going to die, and then I'm going to be raised again. That's what it means to be the Christ, the Son of God. That is not what the disciples understood the Messiah to be. So much so that Peter actually gets mad about it. Peter says, Jesus, that is not what you are here to do. That is not your mission. Maybe we can sort of guess what Peter thought the mission was. Maybe he thought Jesus was here to reform the nation or to rule as a king. But Jesus sets Peter, and Mark notes all of the disciples straight, real fast. He rebukes Peter, calling him Satan himself, the ultimate rejecter of God. The point is clear. Just like Peter says, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. But what it means to be the Christ looks a lot different than any one of the disciples expected. Jesus says, replace the royal garb that you're imagining, replace it with a crown of thorns. Jesus says, replace the throne room with a cross, replace the loyal army with an angry mob. That's what it means to be the Christ, the Son of God. Not pride and glory, but humble, selfless love. And it seems that the disciples don't really know what to do with that. So here's the point of that story. The disciples kind of saw who Jesus was, but their perception of him was blurry. They were closer, but they still failed the vision test. Peter understands that Jesus is the Christ. That's more than the crowds understand, certainly more than the Pharisees or Herod understand, but they don't get what it means to be the Christ, the Son of God. They don't understand the service, they don't understand the humility, and they don't understand His love. Their vision of the Christ, the Son of God, is as blurry as the blind man. And so that brings us to our story that we wanted to focus on today. Back where we started, that weird healing. Let's read it starting in verse 22. It says, "And when they came to Bethsaida, they brought a blind man to him and begged Jesus to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and brought him out of the village. Spitting on his eyes and laying hands on him, he asked, 'Do you see anything?' The man looked up and he said, 'I see people. They look like trees walking.' And again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes, and the man looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him home, saying, 'Don't even go into the village.'" So again, it is a strange, strange miracle. Jesus leads a blind man out of the city, he spits on his eyes, he lays his hands on him, and nothing happens, at least not really. And then he kind of sees, which is better than it was, but everything is blurry and messy. And then the second time Jesus lays his hands on him, now the blind man's healed. And so even though the miracle is still strange, and it is, I'm not going to deny that, hopefully we can start to see where Mark is going with this. Why is this miracle the way that it is? And it's because I think what Jesus understands and what Mark saw here is this miracle is supposed to be a physical, visceral look at an invisible spiritual problem. It's a physical representation of a spiritual vision test. Because this story lines up perfectly with the disciples and maybe our own, at times, spiritual journey in realizing who Jesus really is. The blind man in the story is like a stand-in for the disciples in a lot of ways. Remember where the disciples started in chapter 8? Right before this miracle. They had seen all of the miracles, but they had no understanding of what they meant. They saw the power, but they didn't understand anything about the man who had the power. They're nearly as bad as the Pharisees. They're blind. Just as blind to Jesus as the man who couldn't see anything at all. And then right after this story, when Peter makes the right confession, it seems like they're almost kind of there. He says, "You're the Christ, the Son of God." But it seems like 2 seconds later, Peter's got Jesus over to the side saying, "What are you thinking, Jesus? You don't know anything about what you're supposed to be doing." Even though the disciples had seen all of Jesus' miracles, even though they had heard all the teaching, they are just like the blind man after Jesus' first time laying hands. They see Jesus, they understand that He's special. They understand that He's the Christ. They just don't know what that means. They have no idea what to do with Him. They don't get it. And then really the rest of the book of Mark. From this point on, this is really the turning point in the book of Mark. We start setting our eyes towards the cross directly after this. The rest of the book of Mark is the disciples firsthand having to come to terms with what it means to be the Christ. They're going to see the suffering. They're going to see the betrayal. They're going to see the rejection of the people. And they are going to see His death and resurrection. And then it is only then that their sight of Jesus becomes clear. It's only then that they truly understand what it means to be the Christ, the Son of God. I really think that over the course of the book of Mark, the disciples go through the exact same process that the blind man goes through in those few short verses. And Jesus knew that. And Mark understood that. And this strange miracle serves as a testament to us of what true faith looks like. Jesus didn't fail in healing the blind man. Instead, he uses an unorthodox, we can say, healing approach to tell us something amazing about faith in him. I want to take just a few minutes to apply this story together. And I want to start with what Mark really, I think, wants us to see in this story, that we as Christians need to see Jesus for who he really is, not for who we want him to be, but for who he really is. You know, you're going to hear a lot of opinions. If you just go out into the world and you ask people, who do you think Jesus is? You're going to hear a lot of opinions. Some people think he's a good man, wise teacher. That sounds kind of like what some of the people in the Gospels thought. He's a really good guy, had a lot of smart things to say. Some people think he's complete fiction, didn't exist at all. Others think that he was some sort of prophet or wise philosopher, but they'll stop short of calling him the Son of God. That's an incorrect and blind view of who Jesus is. But let me tell you something. It's really easy to sit in a pew right here dressed in your Sunday best and say, well, because I believe Jesus is the Son of God, I must understand who he truly is. I'm one of the people that sees clearly. I get it. I think Mark 8 challenges that. I think Mark 8 is begging us to ask the question of ourselves, do you see Jesus for who he really is? Jesus is a complex guy. You ever think about that? He teaches about a lot of things. He teaches a lot about things like love, but he also teaches about judgment. He teaches about grace. He teaches about righteousness. He perfectly embodies that godly balance of all things held in the right place. Let me tell you what it's really easy and tempting to do. In fact, I'll tell on myself. I like preaching about grace and I like preaching about love. I like preaching about forgiveness. I like preaching about mercy. Those are my favorite things to talk about. And it's easy sometimes. When I get to choose what I'm going to talk about every Sunday, to hit 4 months in a row of preaching grace and mercy and forgiveness and love. And I sometimes minimize, by omission, the parts of Jesus that are a little harder to talk about. Because the same Jesus that talks about loving your neighbor as yourself is the same Jesus that talks very candidly about hell and about judgment. And both of those things are equally true, and both of those things are equally important. We need a true, whole view of who Jesus is. And it's really easy for all of us to do. I don't know what your preference is, but if you read the Gospels, there's going to be parts of Jesus that you really understand and you really like and are more comfortable for you, and you are going to gravitate towards those parts of Jesus. For me, it might be the mercy and the grace. For you, it might be the righteousness and the justice. Whatever it is, it's really easy to take your favorite parts and say, that's who Jesus is, and we'll just kind of forget about the rest. And let me tell you, it doesn't matter which part of Jesus you're forgetting about. If you're minimizing any part of Jesus, we have problems. Mark 8 is a call to view Jesus completely and totally as he presents himself. And Mark 8 tells us that any viewing of Jesus that isn't the full truth of the gospel is distorted, and it is blurry, and it is not good enough. Mark 8 shows us some of who Jesus is. He shows that He's the one with all the power. He is clearly the Son of God. He is the Creator. He has the power to heal and to give life. As Peter says, Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God, but He's also one who is willing to suffer. He's also one who is humble, who is selfless. He's one who has the love and the grace and the mercy that God exhibits. And He's also one who expects His disciples to follow Him and to truly understand and believe in all of who He is. And Jesus isn't one who's afraid to call out even His own disciples when they miss the mark. Just in a few short verses, we see so much about the man Jesus. And Mark 8 is reaching out and telling us each and every one of those aspects is important and necessary for a true, clear faith. They're necessary for the Christian life. I want to finish just with one thought. It comes from the last 4 verses of this chapter. Right after Jesus rebukes Peter, He calls him Satan for not understanding who he really is. Jesus teaches a second time, and this time He brings all the crowds in, and it feels like He's almost breaking the fourth wall for a second. He feels like He's looking straight through the words, right into my eyes, and He says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For if anyone would save his life, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? And what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when He comes in the glory of His Father with His holy angels. This is why having a true, clear vision of Jesus is so important. Because notice what Jesus says here. Whoever your view of Jesus is going to determine the way that you live. Your perception of the Jesus you follow will be seen in the fruit of your actions. Because Jesus says, my disciples see the love that I'm going to give on the cross, and they say, I'm going to go do that. People who clearly understand what it means to be the Christ, the Son of God, they will follow right in His footsteps. And that means anyone who has a blurry or wrong vision of Jesus can't follow in His footsteps. Jesus reaches out and He says, to truly understand me will change your whole life. It will change the way you live. It will change the way you think. It will change the way you talk. And so Jesus says, I want to leave you one more time with who I am. And He emphasizes He is humble and He is righteous. He has true spiritual focus and a true obedience to the Father. And He says, my disciples, those who have true spiritual sight, will follow the same path. They will follow in the same faith. So Mark 8 reaches out and says, believe in Jesus, but believe in all of Jesus. Follow Jesus, but follow all of Jesus. Because that's the only way to a godly life. So the invitation, as we often offer, is to bow before the Christ, the Creator. Jesus shows himself so clearly in Mark 8 to be the Lord of all the earth, the Creator. And he reaches out to you. And he says, follow me. Join my path. Live a faithful, selfless life. Let your faith, let who you see Jesus be, change who you are. And so if we can help you do that, whether that's coming to the gospel for the first time and having your heart renewed for Him in the waters of baptism, we would love to help you with that. But for those of us who are Christians, I challenge you to think, do you have a true, complete view of who Jesus is? And are you letting that true, clear vision guide your life? Or do we have some things out of place? We would love to help you with that, whether we can talk with you, pray for you, whatever you need. Feel free to come to the front as we stand and as we sing.